We kind of are talking about the Terminator. The enemy leader knows you're coming for him. He's going to hold his meeting in a school. Are you going to do it? That's a question of risk appetite, isn't it? Bottom line up front, it kind of scares me a little bit too, where we are and where we might be going.
Right, so we're talking about robot soldiers. Will there ever be a point where we don't need human soldiers anymore, and what that means for humanity? And actually, I think probably the cultural touch point for this whole topic is probably the Terminator movies. I think we all have this sort of prevailing image of what a robot soldier looks like and will be, but it's probably reductive to just talk about robot soldiers. I think when you think about modern warfare and future warfare, it's also autonomous weapon systems, which are frankly quite terrifying, and even then using AI to run battlefields almost like a game of chess. So we're going to get into all of that, and to take us on this slightly terrifying journey, I'm joined by the brilliant Professor Kenneth Payne, Professor of Strategy at King's College London. So please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and talk about some of the work that you do.
Thanks, Sean. I think you've done a pretty good job of that. I'm Professor of Strategy at King's College London, and I've been thinking about minds in warfare for a quarter of a century or so, and artificial minds, artificial intelligence in warfare for probably the last 15 years. And during the course of that 15 years, of course, as you've just touched on, it's become a much more mainstream topic to think about as AI has matured and developed and is changing like super quickly. So my timing's been good. I came to the subject just as it became super mainstream.
And if you could just give us a sort of broad overview of the, I guess, the state of play, some of the main ways that AI is being used militarily, whether that's robots, weapons, strategy, and sort of just defining what the current situation is.
Well, all sorts, and you've touched on some of the main uses there. One thing I would say, though, you mentioned the Terminator, and it was really commonplace in this subfield, I guess we'd call it, to be cynical about that. And everybody would say, we're not talking about the Terminator, but, and then launch into their discussion of the ways that AI would change warfare. And actually, there's a sense in which we kind of are talking about the Terminator in some of its aspects. I saw recently that humanoid robots had been deployed into the Russia-Ukraine theatre of operations. I imagine there's a lot of hype about that, perhaps more than there is substance, but at least in that respect, we're starting to encroach on Terminator territory. And actually, in a more central aspect, we're getting there, which is of machines that are capable of complex contextual reasoning in the environment that they operate. I think we're all familiar with ChatGPT, and you can imagine ChatGPT applied to these robots as they go into battle. And then you've got something qualitatively different, I think, from where we've been up to this point with discussions of AI on the battlefield, where we're talking about guided missiles, that sort of thing. Instead of that, you can think of it as ChatGPT grounded, if you will, by interacting with the world through its physical platform. And to me, that's starting to sound a little bit Terminator-esque.
It is, it's quite terrifying. So we've got some forms of robots currently being used on battlefields. Are there any examples of how maybe AI or robotic systems are being used to sort of determine strategy, or is that still currently mostly the domain of humans?
Yeah, and that's my area of interest, is in thinking about these strategic questions. So we talk about tactics as what happens on the battlefield. You're moving stuff and people around, trying to get it to the right place at the right time in order to deliver firepower, overwhelm and defeat your adversaries. We refer to that as tactics. And then, so what's strategy? Strategy is part of the larger, bigger picture thinking about war. What is it that we want to achieve here? What is it that they want to achieve here? And how will we and they go about it? Can we get inside their head and try and figure out where they're coming from? And it's this sort of strategic use of AI that I think is really cutting edge. And we're starting to see some signs of that coming to maturity now. Just over recent weeks and months, actually, there have been a lot of stories, for example, about the use of Anthropic's chatbot, Claude, as part of the planning process for US operations against Iran and earlier in the year against Venezuela. So we're at the early stages of AI being used as what's called a decision support tool, helping humans, not making decisions about force on its own yet, but helping humans judge the available information and work through the options that are available to them. And that's strategy, isn't it? And I think uh, the cutting edge AI, these language models, uh, is useful for that because it's able to grasp context in a way that earlier AI wasn't. It's able to think about these questions of mind. What's going on inside your head, Sean? The language model can have a stab at thinking about that. Might not be right, but then I might not be right either. So we can think of it as a strategic voice in a way that we haven't been able to until recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting point about AI because obviously it's progressing very quickly, and you can very easily imagine a future where we do have a super intelligent AI, and it becomes increasingly difficult to justify why you would use a human. I mean, I talked about chess earlier. Chess is such a brilliant example because the greatest minds in chess cannot compete with an AI chess player. And it's very easy to imagine a future where that sort of becomes the case with planning military strategy as well. Do we trust ourselves as humans to make those decisions, or is it better to just outsource it to AI? And I mean, I suppose that comes with ethical issues, which we'll get to. But is it almost an inevitability that that will happen?
Yeah, those ethical issues are super important. They're about the ought question. Ought we to do this, even if we feel we can? But before we get to that, I mean, the chess analogy is really interesting. Like any number of books about war and strategy have chess on the front, but I think it's a pretty poor analogy for what goes on in war. It's a complex game, all right. I don't want to offend your chess playing audience, but it's orders of magnitude more simple than messy, complex, overdetermined reality that world leaders find themselves in when they're thinking about war. Some people think that poker is a better analogy for war because that involves chance and asymmetric information. I know things that you don't know about what's in my hand, and I really like that analogy more than chess. But even poker, modern AI can outperform leading poker players, and so we need to keep in mind that it's highly capable. There are a couple of reasons for being wary about introducing this or relying overly on this sort of AI to make decisions about strategy. One is accountability, the ethical question. And the other is that actually, still at the margins, humans do perform that little bit better at some of the ingredients that are involved in strategy. For example, thinking about other minds. Leading humans are better at these sorts of theory of mind calculations than even state of the art chatbots are. Or forecasting, predicting the future. There's a leaderboard online where artificial intelligence competes against leading humans to make predictions about the future. And for now, the very best humans are still ahead of the very best chatbots, but the gap is closing all the time.
The AI, I mean, we talk about the AI's capacity to make decisions based on, a variety of inputs, but I suppose we probably less think about actually the inputs that it's getting. And I guess, I suppose it's hard to compete with, a very seasoned general who has been to war themselves, has that experience, can sort of get a sense of a battlefield and from soldiers. And I suppose you also need to develop the inputs to that point as well, where the AI can, how does an AI get a sense of the fatigue of the soldiers, and where is it getting that data from? And I suppose it's very easy to feed an AI satellite imagery and stats on ammunition, but I suppose it's much harder for an AI to get that sense of the human mind, as you say.
Yeah, I think experience is important for good generalship or good leadership more broadly, but we want to be careful about overstating how important it is. I mean, plenty of top generals with lots of experience have had disastrous wars and campaigns because war is always throwing up novelty and new things, and perhaps it's your ability to adapt as much as your ability to draw on your previous experience that's the important thing. And there, I think humans still have the edge slightly. So, a leading chatbot, a large language model, as they're sometimes called, has its mind, if you like, set at training time. It just ingests a load of information, and that's reflected in its setup. And after that, it's launched out into the world, and it doesn't learn on the job. And where humans have the slight edge is that we're still learning on the job, on the fly. If we come across something new, we don't need that much exposure to it if it's really important to change our mind, to adjust our assessment of probabilistic outcomes and learn. I mean, we call that learning. And machines are somewhat behind in that ability, and somewhat behind in other aspects of human cognition as well. Their ability to remember things and carry them forward to the next time after they've been trained is still very limited compared to the human mind. So the two things produce similar outputs, words, decisions, but the processes by which they go about it are very different. And each side has strengths and weaknesses. The language model can remember way more stuff than you and I can from its training data. The general might be overly invested in his own personal experience or her personal experience and draw on that overly in a time of novel circumstances. So both are capable of producing misguided decisions, but they go about it in very different ways.
No, I think your point about the changing nature of war is very spot on because I mean, even sort of in our own lifetimes, you can think about how different the Gulf War was fought to say than the war in Afghanistan. To say even the Russian-Ukraine war, we've seen how much these sort of makeshift drones have had such an impact there. And I suppose it's that almost the analog with AI and creating art. And AI can make brilliant pictures, but it's only creating pictures based on stuff that it's seen before. It's ingesting trends and then coming out with a pattern that it thinks is correct. And I suppose maybe AI will struggle to wage wars of the future where it has no experience with how they'll be fought. Is it useful to have an AI that's looking back at historic wars? I mean, I don't want to go back as far as like the Napoleonic Wars or something, but it's I suppose the data that you feed it is at some point becomes useless because the nature of war has changed and it doesn't know how to fight the next war necessarily. It's never seen the next war.
Yeah, I mean, but the truly creative human general, or the genius, as the famous philosopher of war Clausewitz called them, they're exceedingly rare. We're most of us incapable of producing that moment of astonishing creativity, transformative creativity, where you really change the rules of the game. You come up with something that's so far outside of what's been thought possible before, and it's genuinely new and useful. I mean, how often do you do that? I don't think I've ever done it. But some humans do that, and the jury is out on whether artificial intelligence can come up with that sort of brilliant creativity, thinking way outside the parameters of what's been thought possible. There's a really lively debate at the moment. We've got all these incredibly capable frontier large language models. Well, why haven't they discovered something new? Why haven't they discovered a new scientific theory? Why haven't they come up with a new art form that's capable of amazing us, rather than just producing sort of knockoff versions of what we already know? And I think that's a really interesting puzzle to solve. I'm not saying we'll never get there, but I think it's pretty clear we haven't got there quite yet. I mean, set against that though, you don't really want your general to be producing something that's too wacky. Let's throw this at the wall and see if it sticks too often, because it might be an absolute disaster. So it's about finding the right balance, isn't it? And that's one of the reasons why I think humans are still going to be involved at this strategic level for a long time to come, because they can find that right balance. And it's not yet clear to us that we're safe relying on machines to do that.
And then so we've talked a lot about the sort of top level AI deciding strategy. But I guess on the ground you have, and I know we talked a little bit about robots, but also these autonomous weapons systems. And we mentioned Anthropic earlier. They obviously had this big issue with the Pentagon, where the Pentagon wanted the Anthropic to be able to choose targets without human oversight. And I think that is probably for a lot of people quite terrifying. Which I suppose you think, will the robot value human as life as much as it should, or as much as we do, certainly. And I think it probably scares people. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that sort of less top level, more on the battlefield, the sort of tech of the future, I guess, that will be whether it is robots or whether it's sort of machine guns that make decisions on their own without the human oversight. Is that a reality?
Yeah, and to be honest, bottom line up front, it kind of scares me a little bit too, where we are and where we might be going. We've had autonomous weapons for a very long time. If you go back to the Second World War, and an acoustic torpedo, you fire it, and off it goes, and it steers itself depending on whether it can hear the sound of the enemy ship or the submarine. It can adjust its course. So we've had systems that, after you fire them, can adjust their behavior and do their own thing within the parameters that you set for them. But where we're new now is in where we're in new ground now is in the capacity of these things to do much richer types of behavior than just listening for a submarine and deciding whether or not to attack it. We're talking about levels of autonomy that we've never encountered before. And while that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, there are certain forces driving us along that road that are going to be really hard to resist. Firstly, if you think your enemy's going to adopt these technologies and they're going to deliver a huge amount of capability, then it's incumbent on you to have a go yourself, because otherwise you might be overmatched on the battlefield. So there's this sort of arms racing dynamic at work here. Secondly, while you might want humans to be in control and always have the final decision, there are two really powerful forces pushing against that. First is scale. These technologies might unleash huge numbers of autonomous robotic systems on the battlefield, way beyond what a human can hope to control. The idea of a swarm, for example, relies on this sort of approach of overwhelming your adversary through a vast number of capable platforms operating by themselves. And then the other one is speed. You think about this particularly in the domain of cyber warfare, where things happen in the blink of an eye, faster than the blink of an eye, and your cyber attack can be autonomously directed. Well, then you need an autonomous cyber response to handle that. And so you're operating at warp speed, and you've got to decide whether to escalate against the enemy's attack or how otherwise to respond to it, faster than a human can hope to do. So if you combine these three elements, the arms race, the speed, and the scale, you've got some really powerful incentives for trying as hard as you can to develop capable autonomous systems that nonetheless do what you want them to do. You don't want it running out of control. You need to find some way of capturing your intentions for the machine to carry out. And that's super hard, it turns out.
I think this is probably a good point in time to talk about some of the advantages of AI. I mean, you just mentioned some there in terms of the speed, but I mean, the fact that they sort of don't experience tiredness in the way that humans do. They don't have fear on the battlefield. They can have, I suppose, infinite physical advantages versus a regular human. But as I was sort of making this list of advantages, I thought that actually the lack of political cost to starting a war with robots is probably quite worrying, because I suppose it wouldn't really affect the public in the sense of, I think the public would still find there to be cost. But I guess it's much easier for a politician to start a war if there aren't, coffins coming home, with flags draped over them, if you're just sending, robots into a battlefield, especially if it's a sort of asymmetrical battlefield where you're, clearly the more powerful army, and maybe it's just your robots against humans. I think it probably does become easier to start wars, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the jury's kind of out on that one. People have been talking about this tendency for leaders to be more forward-leaning when it comes to the use of force if they don't fear casualties coming back home. And it makes intuitive sense. Of course, you've got to be super careful that the war you started might not be the one you end up with, as I think some world leaders have discovered very recently. Just because you start a war and you think it's going to be robotic and not involve many humans, well, the enemy gets a vote and things can sometimes go a way you don't expect. On your other point, though, about tiredness and the emotionality of war, we know that war is an extremely stressful time for human soldiers, and we know that sometimes soldiers can behave in ways that we wouldn't want them to. I see atrocities as a part of warfare going all the way back through human history. We also see humans more broadly than that making some spectacularly daft decisions in combat that end up costing a lot of lives, their own and perhaps civilian lives as well. There's an argument, there's a powerful argument, I think, that says, well, sure, I hear what you say about needing to be sure that the robots do what we want, but there's a really powerful argument that says, wouldn't we want robots to do this dangerous, dirty work if we could be sure that they would do so better, qualitatively better than a human? They're not going to be frightened. They're not going to feel rage. They're not going to commit atrocities on the battlefield. Well, potentially that's a good thing, isn't it? If we can establish that we can control them to do what we want, we know that they're not going to make these mistakes that come about when humans get involved in warfare. So, as ever, it's a balance, isn't it? You want the machine to do what you want it to do, but if you can do that, then there might be some upsides as well.
I just want to go back to your point about not getting the war that you want in the end, and I think probably a good example of that was the war in Afghanistan, because you had the US, which is overwhelmingly militarily powerful, and yet that war dragged on for so long. It was so difficult, and really they were going against a group of fighters that were very successfully hiding out in mountains. And it's just, I think that's a good example of you can have all of this powerful technology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can wrap up a war very quickly. And I suppose, that will still be the case with robots and AI in the future.
Yeah, war is a struggle of wills and human wills, and no amount of technology takes that out of the equation. I think it can make you feel, as a society, more distant from the battlefield if there aren't many people going, and perhaps technology, as you suggest, will encourage that. But that human will to fight, societal will to fight, I think will remain part of warfare, especially the case if you feel that you or your group has been attacked. And I think for me, the lesson of thinking about war for a few years is that no amount of tactical brilliance can substitute for strategic coherence. Like, you can win every battle and still lose the war. There's a famous line, actually, a famous exchange supposed to have happened towards the end of the Vietnam War, where an American colonel talking to a Vietnamese communist counterpart said, "We never lost a battle." He said, "That's true, and it's not the point." And I think that's important to keep in mind. The technology can help you win every battle, but unless you've got a clear idea of what it takes to break the enemy's will, then you're going to be in trouble.
Now, there are clearly lots of lots of disadvantages to this technology, but I think probably one of the biggest ones is the ethical issue. And I suppose if you're entrusting an AI system or a robot to make difficult decisions in real time, because obviously war is very messy, if you imagine a situation where an autonomous weapon system or a robot killed a child, a civilian child, maybe because the child had a toy gun, that is then very difficult because, whether or not the AI has read the situation correctly, I suppose who then is accountable for that? Is it the company that is producing these weapons? Is it the government that started the war? Is it the people who program the software? Or is it blameless? And then, if it is blameless, then that, I suppose, is an even bigger problem.
Yeah, that issue of accountability, I think, is pretty important here. Is it wider society, and we all agree we're a democracy, and we all kind of agree to go along with this. So perhaps there's blame to be shared around. But one thing you can say won't be feeling accountable is the robot itself, and traditionally that's how you enact military discipline and command responsibility. You, the commander, are responsible for what happens under your command. And autonomy, robots, AI, they kind of challenge that historic view. The reason this is such a problem is, I mean, the case you mentioned of the child with a gun, that's pretty unarguable. You don't child with a toy gun. That's a failure of the censors to realize it's a toy gun. That's a misapplication of the rules of law that say you don't attack civilians, and you definitely don't attack children. Those things are readily fixable, but there are some things in I said they're readily fixable. They're certainly hard, but they're fixable in principle. Like you can develop a robot that can recognize it's a toy gun and can recognize it's a child. But there are some things that are way harder than that to deal with. For example, how much risk to civilians are you prepared to accept in order to achieve your objectives? Now, maybe the answer is none, in which case you're going to fight a super restrictive campaign, and quite possibly, if the conflict is happening where there are civilians, you would lose because you wouldn't be able to take any risk. So you have to make a judgment about risk. You can reasonably anticipate that there might be some civilian casualties from your military activity in this area. Well, how much are you prepared to accept? And those are the sorts of real world calculations that military lawyers and leaders have to take when they're deciding on what to do in conflict. Try and upload that for a machine. It's super hard. One reason it's super hard is because, well, we're changing our mind on it the whole time. Maybe something terrible happens and a school is hit by a missile and you didn't want that to happen. Well, as a result, you ratchet down your appetite for risk and you issue new rules of engagement restricting what your soldiers can and can't do. That's a big problem if your robot soldiers are already deployed and on their way to the battlefield and you can't communicate with them very easily and they're doing it at warp speed and at massive scale. So how do you update your appetite for risk? These are really tough questions. How do and they're human questions. They're not computer science questions. They're questions about us. How do I know what I want to achieve in the future and how hard I'm going to fight to achieve it? I might change my mind. Do I have the ability to update the rules for the robots in order to reflect that change in appetite? So there's a whole bunch of issues there, and it's these edge cases, the really hard cases. The enemy leader knows you're coming for him with very advanced autonomous technology. Well, he's going to hold his meeting in a school to make your task of hitting him significantly more complex than it would have been before. Are you going to do it? That's a question of risk appetite, isn't it?
Many people will have used chatbots and had that experience where you put in a simple prompt or even a very complicated prompt and it just does the wrong thing, and you do your best to make it come out with something correct, but it makes a mistake or it has a hallucination. And we've seen that actually as AI gets more intelligent, it becomes, I think, more difficult actually to restrain the AI and work out where it's going wrong. And I think, I suppose it's not a big issue if you're just asking it to do some homework, but when you're asking it to make these big decisions, I suppose, is it impossible to guarantee that your AI won't make a mistake or go rogue? I mean, I would say probably not, because we've seen the AI companies try and put in guardrails around consumer versions of the AI, and people always find a way to break them, or it breaks themselves. And I think that has suddenly become significantly more worrying when you're using similar AI systems in war. This idea that it could hallucinate or make a mistake, and no one really knows why.
Yeah, I think hallucination is here to stay. I also think the models are getting much more capable month by month, year by year. If you look at where they were 2 years ago, this is such a new technology. 2 years ago they were so bad. Now the current generation of models that engages in what's called chain of thought reasoning, it tries to think through its own judgment. Well, how did I get to this answer? Can I improve the way I got to this answer? They're orders of magnitude better, but they're still capable of doing from time to time what you describe, of confidently asserting stuff, and this is one of the problems because they always confidently assert it, that turns out not to be right. Some people say hallucination, other people might say creativity. And that's the AI version of creativity. You want a model to be non-deterministic, to not go if this, then that. You want it to display some form of imagination or judgment. Well, that's kind of involves hallucination, right? So it's two sides of the same coin. And again, you return to the point I made about risk appetite. How much are you prepared to take? Like, these machines will never be perfect. Perhaps in the messy real world there are no perfect answers. But you also know that war is a competition. The enemy's trying to do this as well. Unless you get involved in the game, you're going to lose. What's your appetite for risk here? How much are you going to trust these machines to do before they have to refer to a human user to get okay or not okay approval? And so I think that's the real challenge for us, especially in liberal democracies, and we want to be ethical, we want to fight wars in the right way, we want to be compliant with the laws. of armed conflict, but we also don't want to lose, or we shouldn't want to lose, because our enemies are determined and ruthless.
And I suppose you come up against this issue of cybersecurity, which we haven't really talked about. But I guess the more you introduce technology into the military machine, the bigger a problem that becomes. And I think if you think about war hundreds of years ago, if you wanted to seize uh, enemy armaments, it meant physically going and capturing a cannon, or physically convincing soldiers to defect and join your side. And whereas now you could potentially have a situation where someone is sitting in a room with a computer thousands of miles away, and potentially taking over your autonomous weapon systems or your robots or even your AI strategist. And I suppose the worrying thing, especially with the AI strategist thing, if you can just gently feed that AI strategist something so that it makes slightly wrong decisions, that's something that might not even be picked up, by your military experts. And I think this issue of cybersecurity, I think, is particularly worrying because, you then start to lose control over your own technology systems.
Yeah, it's super hard. If you build a clone army and they've all got the same vulnerability, then that could be your entire army wiped out in one malicious cyber attack. Or suppose I wanted to do as you say, to kind of influence the models in a way that I might seek to, in previous wars, have influenced populations through propaganda. How do I go about it? Well, I generate millions of AI generated articles. I populate Twitter and Reddit with AI generated content in the hope of poisoning the data that goes into training future models. And I think we can already see some signs that that sort of approach appeals to certain people. I would say on cyber attacks and what have you, very real threat. I would also, it's really hard to make a judgment on this from outside the circle of ultra high level security clearances, and I'm definitely not in that circle. I would say my sort of finger in the air judgment is that Western states, particularly the US, but also the UK, are probably doing reasonably okay in this sort of competition. We've got a long history of being really good at electronic warfare and at cybersecurity. And I suspect that we are at the cutting edge or near the cutting edge of doing this sort of thing to our adversaries, so much as they are doing it back to us. But it's beyond doubt that if you put all your eggs in this AI basket and somebody finds a way of exposing that, then you might be in big trouble. So at the same time, you sort of need to keep an eye on backwards compatibility. Like, what if all these systems go down? What if GPS goes down? Satellite guidance systems in and around the Baltic states, it's already pretty erratic because electronic warfare has ways of complicating that environment. So how do you operate without this cutting edge technology that you've come to rely on? You have to have some way of going back to the old ways, navigating by the stars if you're on a naval warship using a sextant, in the same way that was done in the times of the Napoleonic Wars. It's really tricky again to find the right balance between having the ability to do that and also being at the cutting edge, because it's the cutting edge that will probably deliver the results that you want, provided you can avoid that enemy cyber attack.
And earlier you mentioned this idea of an arms race, which I think does feel inevitable because you can't imagine a situation where China has an AI military technology that the US doesn't have without them wanting to develop it, and vice versa. And I think you can very easily see a situation where that progresses, in the same way that we've ended up with countries having so many nuclear weapons. And I worry, is it possible to regulate or ban this? I mean, you've almost seen the sort of paper tiger situation of trying to prevent war crimes with UN regulations. And maybe it does act as a slight deterrent, but it certainly doesn't stop war crimes from happening. And I just worry that it's going to be the same situation here where there is no feasible way to regulate these weapons. Whether countries publicly say they're doing it maybe is different, but it's very hard to imagine that they won't be developed in secret.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sean. I'm skeptical about the possibility of regulating or having an arms control regime like we have for nuclear weapons. There are a bunch of reasons for that. I think one of the most powerful ones is that this is a dual use technology. You can use it for any number of things, and many of them are not related at all to war. An autonomous car, for example, a Waymo taxi. Well, that sort of technology can be used on the streets of London, as is currently being rolled out, or it can be used to drive a tank through a forest in battle autonomously. So you've got this dual use technology. How do you meaningfully regulate that? That's one problem. A nuclear bomb is designed for one thing only. An autonomous navigation system has plenty of uses, and the same is true of many other AI applications. Another really challenging problem here is like, how do you know what your adversary is up to? What's the signature? What are you looking for? Well, if it's a nuclear weapons program, clandestine nuclear weapons program, well, you can probably find a site with a bunch of centrifuges, or you can find some missile development factory. You can even track nuclear scientists. There aren't many of them, and you can build up an intelligence picture of who there is out there and who's doing what. It's just way harder to imagine doing something like that with AI. And if you're going to have a meaningful arms control regime, you have to have some way of monitoring compliance. The adversary might be saying, no, all this AI technology we've developed is for use in the medical, transportation sectors. Look, we're not using any of it in defense. And then minutes, hours before combat, they upload these capabilities to their legacy platforms, and off they go with a fully autonomous army. So it's really hard to imagine a sense in which you can meaningfully monitor what's going on. And then underneath all that, there's the arms race dynamic, isn't there? If you think these technologies will deliver a powerful offensive advantage, and you worry about your enemy getting there first, you've really got to take measures to stop that. You've really got to get there first with higher quality AI of your own. And that's the dynamic we see emerging in particular between China and the US. And the really tough question for Europe is how hard European countries like the UK, how hard do we try and stay in that arms race dynamic? Or do we effectively say, well, we'll outsource our sovereignty, our sovereign defense, and we'll rely on our long-standing American partner to look after us? Really tough questions.
And I suppose it gives countries with smaller population sizes the opportunity to, I guess, punch above their weight. I mean, I suppose the UK is a good example. I mean, we're much smaller population than the US, but we have, a very high GDP, and so you don't necessarily need the same number of bodies. And then you could think about maybe some of, the Middle Eastern states that have smaller populations but a lot of wealth. You could see them having very sizable robot armies effectively, and they don't necessarily need as many sort of flesh and blood bodies to support military campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of countries out there that might listen to that and think, we might be in a spot of bother here, because some countries have very large manpower intensive armies for reasons other than warding off external threats. They might have them as a means of social control internally, or of absorbing manpower, young men for whom there's not very much economic opportunity outside of being conscripted to serve in the huge manpower intensive national army. And if AI changes the effective of those national armies, those countries have got a bit of a problem. But for the UK in particular, we're in a sort of middle power position. We've got a lot of strength in AI research. We've got Google DeepMind in London, for example, world center of excellence. But we lack a lot of things that America and China have that go into developing these sorts of technologies. Our energy is very expensive, and these frontier AI models they hoover up an awful lot of energy for these vast data centers. And we don't have a frontier AI company ourselves generating these chatbots. It's Anthropic, an American company, Meta, an American company, Google DeepMind. So yes, DeepMind is a British company by origin, but they're in an alliance now wholly owned by Google, because Google had all the computers. They had all the data centers that's needed to get this stuff up and running. So if you decide that these things are really important for generating military power, you've got a tough choice to make. Do you try and do it on your own, or do you accept that you're going to be reliant? Some might skeptically say even have a sort of client relationship with countries that are producing this stuff for you. And at the moment, de facto, that's kind of where we are. We've more or less decided that we're going to be using American technology to provide a core part of our defense capability in the years to come. Perhaps you're happy with that, perhaps you're not. But if you're not, then you've got to have a plan B.
Okay, and to take us back to the start, I'd love for you to sort of give me your wrap up prediction, I guess, for whether there will be a point in the future where the military is fully mechanized. You don't have any human involvement. The strategy is managed by AI systems. The physical warfare is managed by machines, whether it's robots or weapons or a combination of the two. Is that a future, or will there always at some point be need for humans in the chain?
I think we'll see space right at the top for human judgment. In the worst case scenario, if you've seen House of Dynamite, the drama about the nuclear attack on America, when a nuclear missile is launched, you've still got 20 minutes or so before it arrives. And that's a very small window of opportunity, but it's a window for human judgment to come into play. So I think at this strategic level, right at the top, there'll still be, even with compressed timelines, scope for human judgment to decide what's best for the human societies that have elected, in our case, the human to be the leader. And you want that human there for reasons of accountability. You also want them there, for the moment, for reasons of good judgment. And we may see that good judgment being challenged by AI judgment in the not too distant future. But right at the top, space for human judgment. Lower down at the tactical level, I think for a long time to come, we'll still see humans on the battlefield because it's really hard to have, particularly in the land domain, it's really hard to have resilient robots. The battlefield is an austere and muddy place, and it's hard to keep them going in the way that you might want. What sort of power are they getting? How long does the battery last? Battery technology lags AI technology considerably. So there are some prosaic reasons why I think you're going to see human infantry soldiers on the battlefields of the future for many years to come. But never say never. And the balance is shifting between autonomous platforms at the tactical level and humans, and I think it will continue to shift. I think we'll see fewer humans on the battlefield in the future and much more capable tactical systems. Think of R2-D2 in Star Wars. There's a robot that is going into battle alongside its human, and it's providing a backup source of context-rich judgment. I think we'll see more R2-D2s and fewer Luke Skywalkers.
That feels like a brilliant point to end. Thank you so much for speaking to me. It was tremendously interesting.
Great. Thanks, Sean.